Welcome ninjas to the Ninja All-Stars tutorial. Ninja All-Stars is a game for 2 to 4 players, each controlling a team of ninjas, trying to best each other in a series of challenges. To start the game, you must first determine who has initiative. You can do this any way from rock, paper, scissors, or doing what's called an opposed attribute test. At the start of each game, each player will of course have a team of ninjas connected to a certain attribute. In this tutorial, I'll be using the Fire Shrine and the Void Shrine starter sets. So to do an opposed attribute test, each player will take 3 of the special dice in the game, and then they will roll them, looking for the symbols that match their shrine. Here, the Fire Shrine rolling the black dice and the Void Shrine rolling the white dice. The Fire Shrine would gain the initiative because they rolled the symbol matching their attribute. If you have a tie, simply re-roll until there is no longer a tie. After you determine who has initiative and what exactly your team setups are, you would choose your challenge. Ninja All-Stars has 8 unique challenges to choose from within the box. For this setup, I will go with the basic brawl scenario. Each scenario will have a special set of rules that may change how setup is performed. So this is when you would then begin to create the board. This board has 2 sides to it, so you can pick from either side and lay it flat while putting the 2 separate tracks here on the sides. On the corners here of each of the tracks, you'll have 2 spots. One is the training dojo, and the other one is the healing house. When playing with 2 to 4 players, each player will take 1 pair to call their own, and that's where they will place their models. Here is the score track for each player. So once the board has been set up like such, you will take the round token and place it on round 1 with the shuriken side face up. The other side is a 10. Showing when you've reached the 10 rounds. Each scenario also has a potential limited number of rounds, so this is how you keep track of it. Each player will then take their respective marker for victory points and put it onto the 0 space of the victory point track. You will then roll a die and place the moon phase tracker on its respective face. Here I rolled fire, so we'll place this onto the fire spot. Then you'll take the moon deck, shuffle it up, place it onto the board in its respective spot, and each player will draw a hand of 3 cards, starting with the player who has initiative and then going clockwise. Now, starting with the player who has initiative, you will then take turns alternating, placing either lanterns or shrines on the board on any circular spot. The significance of lanterns and shrines are that they are pieces of terrain that modify the board. They can't be moved through, and you can't draw a line of sight through them. So it's a good idea to put them in areas that kind of block your opponent or give you extra cover. When you place the shrine onto the board, you will also give it a certain status ailment. You have the options from the 3 negative effects: slow, curse, and poison. Or you have an option between the 3 positive effects: lucky, protect, and haste. It's also worth noting that these tokens cannot be placed on top of each other, and they cannot be placed within 2 spaces of any deployment zone. The deployment zone is one of these circles that has these 4 arrows around it that usually mark the edge of the board, so they must be at least 2 spaces away. You keep taking turns placing lanterns and shrines until you have at least 4 lanterns. The maximum is 6. And the maximum for shrines is 4. Once you have 4 lanterns on the field, You then have the option to pass. If both players pass consecutively, setup is then complete. Once you finish setting up the board, you will then deploy your ninjas. Again, starting with the player who has initiative, they will take one of their ninjas and place it onto a deployment zone after they selected their board edge. So, since the Fire Shrine player has the initiative, they will take one of their models and place it just like such. And then going clockwise, the other players will then take their board edges if you're playing with 3 to 4, or if you're only playing with 2, the second player will then take the opposite board edge and do the same. You keep going back and forth placing ninjas until the allotted number of ninjas for your specific scenario is reached. In this example of Brawl, the maximum number of ninjas available on the field, or allowed on the field rather, is 7. So the players will keep going back and forth until they have placed their 7 ninjas on the field. And the rest will be placed inside the training dojo, off to the side of the board. Once you have done that, you're ready to start playing Ninja All-Stars. The way the game works is that you'll take turns activating a single ninja, performing a move, and then an action, in that order. There are a lot of advanced rules and circumstantial rules that come into effect when playing the game, but for now, let me just explain the base mechanics and the things that you'll be doing the most of, and then I'll get into the advanced rules of play. So, to put it simply, the player with initiative will pick any ninja and activate them. Looking on that ninja stat card, you can see their attributes. The blue number is their movement, the red is their attack, and the brown is their defense. So we'll just take any one ninja and move them. Now there are some elements of terrain here. There's a symbol here that looks like 2 arrows pointing upwards that represents rough terrain. Rough terrain requires 2 movement points to move on top of. This tree represents foliage, which means that it is also rough terrain, and it is known as obscuring, meaning that you cannot draw a line of sight through it. This marker represents a structure, which means that it is elevated terrain and obscuring terrain. And then of course these elements are not shown on this particular board, but there's also obscuring terrain and elevated terrain. So I mentioned what happens with rough terrain. It takes 2 movement points to move on top of it for each time you're moving on top of a piece of rough terrain. To move to a piece of elevated terrain from a point of non-elevated terrain counts as 3 movement points. Once you're on that elevated piece of terrain, moving then costs a normal 1, and moving down is also just 1. So let me just take this tuning over here and start moving them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After you've completed your movement, you will then point your model towards one of the 8 adjacent dots here. Each model has a small nick on their base, showing you what is their front. Depending on how you paint your models, you could also do some sort of marker to show where exactly they're pointing with little to no confusion. The reason why this is important is because you then create what's known as your influence zone. You have a front arc and a rear arc. So depending on where you point them, it would change your arc like such. If I am facing directly left, these 5 white spaces become my front arc, and these 3 black spaces become my rear arc. If I were to point at an angle, that changes my arcs, like such. The reason why this is important is because enemies can get benefits for being in your rear arc, and you can only usually target and perform actions to other units within your front arc. After you finish your movement and decided you're facing, you can then perform your action. There are a handful of actions that you can choose from that I'll explain later, but of course the basic action being attacking one another. But let me get into that influence arc just a little bit more. It's also a very good defensive technique. If an enemy ninja is inside your front influence arc and attempting to move out of it or into another space, you will then have to dodge your opponent. This opponent is aware of your presence and trying to strike you down as you're running past them. The way that you do a dodge check is an attribute test. You'll roll your 3 dice, and if you get any symbols matching your shrine, you successfully dodge. If you don't, you will take a stun token and have to immediately end that model's activation. So it's very important to pick the proper facing once you finish moving your model. It's how you build a wall of defense and protect yourself from being backstabbed. Once you finish activating your model, you'll simply place an activation token next to them showing you that you have activated that model. Let's fast forward it a bit and go to the end of the round. Once both players have activated all their models on the field, you will then begin what's known as the upkeep phase. Beginning with the player who has initiative, as always, and proceeding clockwise, each player must perform the following steps. 1. If you have a unit within the healing house, you will take one of your models and place it into your training dojo. Then you will remove all your activation tokens on the field. Help clean it up. And then you have the option between 3 different things. You can 1. Draw another moon card. These cards are pretty helpful because they can be used at any point and can change the game's effects dramatically. 2. You can move an additional model from your healing hut into your training ground. Or 3. You may remove all stun tokens from one friendly model. After you've made your choice from one of those 3 options, you will then deploy friendly models from your training ground onto your deployment zone until the maximum number of models allowed by the challenge are on the board. If of course you don't have enough models to fill your ranks, you will then also stop deploying. After you've done that, each player will then, clockwise, be able to make those same choices and redeploy their units if necessary. Once every player has done that, you will advance the moon tracker clockwise 1 space, and then of course advance the round tracker up 1 number. To begin the new round, you will make an opposed attribute test. Whoever wins the test now has the initiative for this new round. So those are the basics of the game. Now let's get into all the different actions and how those all get resolved. I mentioned of course movement and the different terrains that affect it. Of course the shrines and the lanterns can't be moved through, but they both have a sort of area of influence. The shrines especially. If you move within 1 space of a shrine with a negative status ailment, you'll have to perform an attribute test. And if you fail it, you then get the status ailment from that shrine. The same does not go though for the positive effects. In order to acquire the positive effect shrines, you must of course be within 1 space of it, but then attempt to acquire the shrine's positive effect via an action. So if I were to take this model, move her up, and attempt to grab that shrine, I will of course have to make my attribute test, and if I pass, I will then get the matching ailment on that model. So that's a possible action to take. Another action to take is to go into stealth. If no model can draw a line of sight to you when you're about to perform this action, you're then allowed to perform the action. The way that you determine line of sight is that you draw 1 line from your base to any point on your opponent's base, and if there's no interceding terrain, i.e. structures like lanterns, shrines, or the actual structured terrain, or the foliage, those are all obscuring terrain. If the line does not cross any of those conditions, you have line of sight. When you get a model on elevated terrain, it starts to complicate the rules a little bit. So when drawing line of sight both to and from models on elevated terrain, non-elevated terrain and models are ignored. Because you see, models, friendly or enemy, also block line of sight. However, line of sight is blocked if the line crosses another space of elevated terrain that is not within the elevated model's influence zone or a separate element of elevated terrain. So for example here, let's say this ninja was attempting to make a range attack to this tuning. Line of sight, perfect. Even though this model is on elevated terrain, there's nothing in between the two, it's still good. However, if we move this model one space back, you can see here that the front influence zone covers these spaces of elevated terrain. And so these spaces can be ignored. And we draw a line of sight, and there's nothing else blocking, so it's fine. If we were to have the lantern here, line of sight would not be blocked, because this model is on a piece of elevated terrain. It ignores anything else that's not elevated. It's still not blocking like there. However, it would be blocking right here. If we were to move the model back one more space, again, we look at the front influence arc and see that these spaces of elevated terrain are not within that arc, and so still block line of sight, and the line could not be drawn there. So that's line of sight. If no other model has it to you, if you were to draw this line, I could move this ninja over a few spaces, and I could go into stealth. Models in stealth cannot be attacked or targeted by abilities. However, if game effects affect an area of the game board that includes that model's space, it'll affect it normally. Line of sight cannot be drawn to a model in stealth, but line of sight can be freely drawn through the model and the space it occupies. A model in stealth only has an influence zone during its activation, so that means other enemies do not have to perform dodge rolls in order to move past them. It also means that the model cannot assist others in combat when it's in stealth. If a model in stealth takes any action or takes an affinity check other than dodging, it loses stealth. So remember, dodging is when you're moving from a space within the front influence arc of an enemy. You perform that check, and if you fail, however, this time you won't take a stun token. Instead, you'll simply remove the stealth token. And then you can attempt to do it again, or cut your losses there. If an enemy is in stealth, don't worry, there's still something you can do about it. You can search for them. You can use your action to search for enemy models in stealth. You take an affinity test, and if you're successful, all enemy models within the model's front influence zone must remove their stealth token. So if we were to have our player go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just like that, make the test. If they passed, bam, no stealth for you. However, that was that unit's action, so if you really want to capitalize it, you need to have your buddies ready and waiting to strike. There are certain actions that are called stealthy, search being one of them. Any action, attack, or ability that is stealthy does not cause the model to lose stealth when it's used. So you can dodge and you can perform stealthy actions. Otherwise, you will lose your stealth anytime you perform any other action or affinity test. But alright, now we're ready to talk about the combat dice. So when you make an attack, obviously, you will compare your attack dice versus the enemy's defense dice, and any modifiers. So here, just the base, this Kaiken has an attack of 3, and that Kunoichi has a defense of 1. Just like that. And you roll it. However, you can get bonuses potentially. If you have a model that has that same target within their front influence zone, you will get 1 bonus dice for every model which it applies. So in this example here, my target is within the influence zone of 2 other allies, and so I would get 2 dice. Another way to get a bonus is if you're doing an attack from their rear arc. If this model is facing in this angle direction, I'm within their rear arc here with this attacker specifically, and so I will get another dice. If I'm attacking from stealth, the attacker would remove my stealth, but I would also get another bonus dice. All is not lost, however. The defender does also have the opportunity to have bonus dice. In the same way that my allies are assisting me, their allies could be assisting them. The defender gains an additional dice for each additional friendly model that is in the attacker's influence zone. So if I happen to have two buddies right here, the defender would get 2 dice. And just like that, you would roll them and compare the results. Now we'll refer to our dice guide on this one. You can see that each symbol is a cross from another symbol that is its direct opposite. When you look at the dice, you will cancel out every dice that are direct opposites from each other. So here, the fire player has rolled a void, and the void player has rolled 2 spirits. These two are direct opposites of each other, and so they will all get cancelled out entirely. And here we have a fire and a water, and those are gone as well. You will then, after making all cancellations, look at who has the most dice left in the pool. As you can see, clearly the Fire Shrine player wins this. However, that doesn't mean they necessarily win combat. What it means is that they now get to choose the result of this combat from the dice that are left available from their pool. So looking back at our dice guide, you can see that each dice has a different result. The spirit dice says that the attacker is injured. When a model is injured, you take them away from the board and put them into the healing hut. The void symbol says that the defender is injured. They probably would not want to pick the spirit symbol as the result of the attack, because that means their own model would be injured and removed from the board. Earth means that the defender is stunned. Air means that the attacker may move the defender up 3 spaces in any direction, ignoring any special terrain, but otherwise following other rules like not being able to move certain objects, like the shrines and lanterns. Water means that the player who picked water as the result may move the attacker up to 3 spaces in any direction. The defending player then places their defender in the attacker's front influence zone. And fire means that all models in the attacker's influence zone, including the attacker, are stunned. So in this example here, let's just say that the red player wants to resolve the earth. So they will, and the defending player becomes stunned. I'll explain what all the status effects do after combat, but let's run a different scenario here. What if, after we've rolled all these dice, the symbols were something more like this? When the results are tied as far as who has the most dice, the attacker wins and then gets to pick the result. Although in this specific scenario, even though fire wins, they only have one result to choose from. But let's say the defender won after all cancellations were made, and this was the result. The defending player then gets to pick from their dice the result of the combat. So as the defender, I assume that they'd pretty much want to go for spirit, because this means that the attacker is injured. So that's how combat is resolved. But there also is range combat. Some models have range combat as an option on their card. That range keyword is also followed by a number, and that number is the maximum range in which the range attack may be performed. Range attacks work exactly like normal attacks, except that the only results that cause any effect are earth and void. You can choose the other effects but they will have no effect, unless the model says otherwise. If you are adjacent to any model when attempting to make a range attack, you cannot, even if the model you're attacking is not adjacent to you. Range attacks can also not benefit from assists or back strikes. Also, it's worth mentioning that every model has access to shuriken or kunai. This means that every model can make a range attack with a maximum range of 3 spaces. However, when you use it, you can only roll a single dice and it cannot benefit from any bonuses. However, these attacks are stealthy, so you could perform them while in stealth and still maintain your stealth. However, it's kind of a gamble because if you're only rolling 1 dice, if that gets cancelled, then your opponent gets to pick the result. However, remember, only Void and Earth can be chosen as the result. So it potentially means that your opponent could stun or injure themselves. Or they could simply pick any of the other elements and would have no effect. Lastly, before we start talking about the status ailment and finish off this tutorial, let's go over the cards. These cards have great effects that can change the result of a combat roll or help you clutch out that pinching moment. They have 2 abilities on them, top and bottom. Whenever you play the card, you always get the top ability. However, if the phase of the moon currently matches the symbol on the card, you instead get the bottom ability, which is usually a better effect. These cards can be played at any point, as long as the card's prerequisites for when they can be played are met, and you simply place it and do its effects. However, I should note that a lot of these cards allow you to re-roll dice. Once a dice has been re-rolled, it may not be re-rolled again. So you couldn't combine card effects to re-roll a single dice until you got the result you wanted, or you couldn't roll a dice and then have your opponent have you re-roll that dice. Dice can only be re-rolled once. Also, if you ever get more than 3 cards in your hand, you must immediately discard 1 before you can continue your turn. Your maximum hand for these special moon cards is 3. Alright, so those are the basics of the game. So now we can just cruise on and I can explain what all these different status effects mean. Here we have the different status effects in the game. 4 negative, 4 positive, and 1 that's also technically negative. First off, curse. When a model is cursed and makes a roll, an enemy player may remove the token to force the model to re-roll all of its dice. So if you get a good result and you happen to have a curse token on you, your opponent could turn the tables and have you re-roll that. Next up, we have is poison. When a model is poisoned, you roll a dice at the end of its activation. If the result is water, the model is stunned. If the result is spirit, the model is injured. After the roll is made, remove 1 poison token. And it's also worth noting that these status effects, you can have multiple of them on a single model, but their effects don't stack. But that means like if you have multiple poisons on you, it'll be a while before it comes off entirely. Next up we have here is slow. At the beginning of a slowed model's activation, remove 1 slow token. During that activation, the model may only move half of its movement rounded up. So it does what you think it would. And then stun. Stun models cannot assist. When a model gets 3 stun tokens, it is immediately injured. At the beginning of a model's activation, remove all stun tokens on it. And during the activation, the model may either move or take an action. It may not do both. And lastly, for the negative effects here, we have delay. Only models in the healing hut can be delayed. A delayed model cannot be moved to the training ground. At the beginning of a new round, remove one delay token from each model that has one. So it's a way to keep a potentially good threat off the board off for longer. But there are good status effects. Here we have haste. A model with haste may remove one haste token at the beginning of its activation in order to either move a second time or take a second action at any time during its activation. We also have lucky. When a lucky model makes a roll, it may remove a lucky token to reroll all of its dice. We have protect. When a protected model is injured, it may remove one protect token to be stunned instead. Or alternatively, if it's stunned, it may remove one protect token to ignore the result completely. And lastly, we have the best status effect in the game, moon power. A moon-powered model cannot be stunned and cannot be injured. When a model becomes moon-powered, it removes any stun tokens on it. In addition, the model ignores other models in influence zones when moving. And at the end of the model's activation, you remove the token. It's essentially invulnerability for its activation. But that's it. That's Ninja All-Stars. Each game is different, each scenario has different conditions for victory, and once you've reached it, you can declare yourself the winner. There are extended rules known as league play that can really mix up your gaming experience and enrich it even further. It's also worth noting that these starter ninja shrines here aren't even accurate representations of the actual shrines in the game. If we look in the book here, it has all the stats for every clan in the game. And we can see just here off the bat, it says that Yaijiri have different stats here in the book than they have on this starter card. So these are just to help you to get a beginning feel of the game and enough diversity between the shrines to have variety. But once you're comfortable playing the game, you can move past these little starter sets and make your own team. But I'll explain more about that in the next video about League play. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions regarding the game or any other games I've played or any other comments, you can always tweet me, send me a message, or leave a comment. But that's it. Thanks for watching.